Welcome to today's lesson, Cool Carbon Sink. Do you remember the phrase about water we learned in our last lesson? It was slow it, spread it, sink it. What did we learn was especially important in helping to soak up water? Plants. Well, in today's lesson, we're going to learn about ways that plants also help to soak up and hold carbon. This is especially important in keeping excess carbon out of our atmosphere, so we'll learn about the carbon cycle and the human impact of it. All right, make sure to get your garden journal out and take notes as I go through our vocab. Our first phrase is human impact. We've learned this one before, so you might remember that it's the effect that humans have on the environment. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Today we'll look at the human impact on the carbon cycle, which is not good. Our next vocab term is carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is a process where carbon dioxide travels from the atmosphere into living organisms in the earth and then back into the atmosphere. The carbon cycle works by a balance between animals and plants. Animals, like humans, breathe oxygen in and breathe out a form of carbon called carbon dioxide. Plants work the opposite way. They breathe in the CO2 that humans and animals breathe out, and they create oxygen in the process of photosynthesis, which is how they make their own food. The carbon cycle doesn't just include the carbon in the air that gets breathed in and out by animals and plants. It also includes the carbon in our bodies, or in plant matter. When plants or animals die, the carbon in their bodies gets decomposed and either goes up into the atmosphere or gets absorbed and decomposed into the soil. When carbon from plants or animals gets absorbed into the soil and transformed over many, many years, it can turn into fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are the remains of plants, animals, and other living things that lived long ago, found deep in the ground, in a form that is now usable for energy. Let's take a closer look at how fossil fuels are formed. So, we're starting here with organic matter. These are things like dead animals, dead plants, and bones that are all full of carbon. That carbon slowly breaks down and releases over time. And what happens over many years is that organic matter will get buried, and as millions of years go by, it will get compressed, and as the carbon releases, it will be transformed into things like oil, coal, and natural gas. And we call those things fossil fuels. But how do we use fossil fuels if they're so deep in the ground? We use fossil fuels and we extract them up from the ground and use them as energy or fuel to power our cities, our cars, and our manufacturing. So what happens when we burn fossil fuels? Well, we're taking carbon that was stored into the ground and burning it. That creates CO2 emissions, which means carbon dioxide emissions. The emissions are the amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere as a result of burning those fossil fuels. Basically, it's the amount of carbon that we put in the air that was once in the ground. And remember, the atmosphere is just a fancy word for the layer of air that surrounds the Earth. The atmosphere is where all the emissions go and they get held. The one tricky part about our atmosphere, though, is that it acts sometimes like a bubble around the Earth, and that bubble traps all the carbon inside of it. This can be a problem because as the carbon goes into our atmosphere and gets trapped inside the bubble becomes thicker, like a blanket around the Earth that heats it up. And that causes things like the ice caps to melt. What's really cool is that right now We're starting to transition to better ways of getting our energy, like using windmills or solar energy, which provide energy without burning fossil fuels and putting carbon in the air. This is much better for our planet. Another thing that helps to keep carbon out of the air is our plants. Trees and forests can act like a big storage center for all the carbon in the air. They suck it out of the air and put it in their bodies and keep our planet really nice and cool. We just learned a lot about the carbon cycle, so I'm going to try and simplify it all for you guys. Basically, all living things use carbon, and when those living things die, that carbon can be transformed over millions of years into fossil fuels underground. Right now, humans are having a negative impact by taking fossil fuels and using them for energy. But soon, we will be using new energies that do not have a negative impact. Now it's time to hear from your garden teacher to learn more about the carbon cycle and ways you can reduce your impact.
Welcome everybody to our Cool Carbon Sinks Oak lesson. So in the video today, we talked about our carbon cycle. Carbon is something that all bodies, all living things have inside of them, and it circulates throughout our world. It begins with us, and when we die, when our plants die, all of that carbon ends up in the ground, and plants absorb carbon from the atmosphere and take it into their bodies. We as humans breathe in oxygen, and what do we exhale? We exhale carbon, and it's this cycle that has been a part of our world since the beginning. But as you saw in the video, there is an effect that humans are beginning to have on the carbon cycle. Again, that term, our human impact. We are extracting or taking carbon out of the ground. This carbon is housed in the ground in the form of fossil fuels, and we are extracting those fossil fuels, taking them out of the ground and using them to power our homes and our cars and such. And when we're taking that carbon out of the ground, it's ending up in our atmosphere, and we're beginning to see how it has an effect on the environment in not so good a way. It's making our ozone layer, or that greenhouse effect, thicker, and remember, there's this blanket around the earth that's making it a little bit warmer. But there are many ways to combat this human impact that we're facing, many ways where we can lessen our human impact. One way is planting a garden or planting trees, because all of this vegetation, all of these plants that we can grow and even harvest from and use to feed ourselves, in the process of it growing, it's actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. It's taking that carbon and it's turning it into a leaf, or it's taking that carbon and it's turning it into an ear of corn, or it's taking that carbon and it's turning it into a sunflower like we have here. So by planting a garden, you're combating that carbon. By planting a garden, you're combating that carbon that's ending up in our environment and turning it into living things. And here in our garden at Pacheco, we are doing something really cool, where once the plants that have passed in our garden, they've lived out their lifespan, instead of pulling them out and throwing them into, say, a garbage can, we're actually keeping them and putting them into our compost pile, which I'll show you if you follow me. So, in the video, we talked about how we can lessen our human impact by maybe carpooling and using less fossil fuels. And as important as those things are to do, it's also really important to see that there are other ways that we can take and reduce the amount of carbon that's ending up in the environment. And one way is creating a compost pile. All of this is carbon. This is all carbon that if we were to throw it into our garbage can, say, and it goes out to a landfill, that carbon is going to release all of itself into the atmosphere. But when we keep it here in our compost pile and we turn it and we take care of it and we give it enough nitrogen and that carbon ratio, it's actually going to turn into soil, and we're going to be able to use that to plant more vegetables, to take more carbon out of the atmosphere. So composting, gardening, great ways to reduce the amount of carbon that's in our atmosphere. And also carpooling, all very important. So thanks for joining along in our video today, and we'll see you next time.
Let's see what you learned. Take a couple minutes to try and answer these questions in your garden journal.